Hello, I'm Alicia Copeland. Welcome to an introduction to the impact of blockchain on legal. Now, to introduce our speaker, Joe Rozinski. Joe is an innovator and early adopter of all things computer related. His primary focus is around the future of technology, and he speaks around the world about legal technology, cybersecurity, blockchain, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, and drone technology. He writes about the future of technology as it impacts the crossroads of our personal and professional lives, especially in the legal sector. He also co-hosts a podcast with a tech focus, serves as a mentor with the Columbia IBM Blockchain Accelerator, is a cybersecurity committee member at the University of South Florida, and is a presidential committee appointee to the American Bar Association's Center for Innovation Governing Council. Currently, Joe is with Thomson Reuters Legal, managing a team of technologists for the large law, corporate, and government divisions in the U.S. Joe serves the top law firms in the world, consulting on legal trends and customizing Thomson Reuters legal technology solutions for enhanced workflows. You can connect with Joe at joetechnologist.com or josephraczynski.com or on Twitter at JoeRaz. I will hand it to Joe now. Thank you.
Alicia, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thank you all for joining today. So we are obviously going to be talking about the introduction of and the impact of blockchain on the legal space. And this is something that I'm absolutely looking forward to, and I think should be a lot of fun for all of us. But let's take a picture, a glimpse into the overview of what we're seeing today. So today I will level set. I've given quite a few talks recently, and sometimes I give this part of it and sometimes I don't, but I think it's pertinent and relevant to today's discussion. So I will talk about the current state of technology, and then we'll dive into it. Okay, so how does blockchain have an impact on the legal sphere? What you do on your daily basis. Maybe it may not touch you right now, but going forward, how could it filter into potentially discovery or into contracts? So all of those pieces. So we're talking about the technology and of course the practice and then the potential. So the future. What are we looking at? What impact will it have on all of us going forward? So here we go. All right. Let's level set. What is going on right now in technology? Why are we even talking about blockchain? Let's start with this. This is a concept that I've been talking about for probably the last 6 years, but I do believe it is extraordinarily relevant for all of us. We're talking about exponential growth. Now, sadly, we're probably a little too intimately familiar with what exponential growth looks like when we're talking about the pandemic. But that is an aside, because that was a real use case for what we're seeing in terms of exponential growth. We're familiar with this probably from grammar school and this graph that we all once saw way back when, where we saw this arrow just continue to go up at this dramatic pace. What I like to do is sort of level set and take a step back and say, okay, before we get to even talking about exponential growth, let's talk about what linear growth feels like. And this comes from Singularity University. And this is the idea of, okay, this is what we're most familiar with. This is something that we've seen, interacted with for probably all of our existence since the beginning of when you were a little kid, what you're used to, what you're familiar with, what you're accustomed to. So what does linear growth feel like? Well, if I were to take 30 linear steps, where am I going to go? Right? Most of us are probably working from home right now, or whatever the case is. Maybe you're in the office. Let's pretend we're all in the office right now. So you pop up from your desk and you walk 30 linear steps, which is essentially 30 yards, 30 meters, right? Where would you end up? Maybe you end up in the break room, right, to get a coffee, or maybe closer to the bathroom. Whatever the case is, you're walking 30 yards. 30 linear steps equals 30 yards. Very straightforward, I know. Okay. This is what we're used to. And I think about this when I was doing my DNA test. Our brains, our minds have not changed in over 200 to 250,000 years. So I think to myself, okay, my DNA test comes back and I look at it and I said, oh, geez, wow, this is fascinating. If I were to look at this, and it actually has in this basically saying that my grandmother, far removed, grew up on the plains of Africa many moons ago. And I think about what her existence was like back then. I said, okay, what was she used to? Well, she had friends and family all were close to her, right? And the hunting and gathering were known. So she knew where to get water. She knew where to get vegetables. All of those things were within reach. They were all local. They were all linear. That's what our brains, literally our physical brains, have been used to for over that course of time for forever. But now so much has changed around us that it's almost impossible to think about the implications of that on our lives going forward. So that's the way we have had to sort of look at these things over the years. So in that light, in that realm, what does it look like if we were to say, okay, going back to that first example, what does exponential growth feel like? Instead of the linear growth, what does that exponential growth feel like for us right now with all of the changes afoot around us? Well, if I were to take those same 30 exponential steps instead of the linear steps, and we all know what that looks like, right? It's the 1, 2, 4, it's that constant growth, the doubling of every instance. Well, I would travel around the earth 26 times in those 30 exponential steps. That's roughly 1 billion steps. This is the pace of everything now going forward. And we're at this inflection point where this is actually starting to hit. So if I were to start to use examples, and I love to use examples at the beginning of talks because it sets context for why we're even talking about some of these technologies as they filter into the legal industry. So the first one that I like to talk about is drones. Now, I've had drones for probably, I guess, 5 or 6 years now since they've become a little bit easier to work with. The first drone I had was yay big, quite large, had a huge backpack, and I could let it loose and it could travel maybe a mile or so. Now I have this drone that's literally as big as 6 inches wide or long, and it can go 10 kilometers, so about 7 miles away, full HD video. I can see it the entire time, and I do not take it that far because I know it's illegal. But you get the idea. These drones are amazing. So when I started talking about this sort of thing way back when with people, one of the use cases was, all right, I am a lifeguard down in Australia, and I see someone struggling in the water. They have massive waves down there. They have sharks, all sorts of stuff, right? So someone's high atop their perch, and the lifeguard, she's sitting there looking across the landscape of water and saying, oh, geez, I see someone struggling. So what does she have to do? Well, she has to pop off that lifeguard stand, run across this huge sand, a ton of sand that's hot. She's got her lifeguard stuff with her, and she's traipsing across. Then she has to dive into the water and then swim all the way out, battle the waves to get to somebody. Now, and they dreamt this up back then, they said, what could we do? Well, let's launch a drone within 15 seconds from when she sees someone struggling in the water, get it aloft, get it out above those individuals who are struggling, and then drop an inflatable that can land right near them, hopefully not on them, and then it blows up such they can swim to that and they can rest and they can be in a much better spot to be able to be saved. Not long ago, this actually happened, and hopefully this will play for you. So it was dropped, and you could then allow this thing to fill up, and then people could swim over to it. This is that exponential growth. And these are the technologies that are starting to converge, come together to allow us to be able to do things that we've never been able to do before. The next example is in Dubai, they're starting to launch these drones. So when we're talking about the flying car that maybe as a kid they talked about, oh yeah, someday they'll have that, it's coming. And we're not that far away from it. Finally, we're not that far away from it. So keep your eyes in the sky for that sort of thing. My favorite example that I bring up every once in a while is this one. This is the idea that an MIT student came up with this concept where this goofy little contraption that wraps around his ear, goes along his neck and towards his chin, has 4 sensors in that. The sensors allow him to think of something, literally think of something in his head, and then transmit that to some IoT connected device, such that he'd be able to interact with his TV or interact with any other connected device. And so you're at a point where if 2 people had these things, maybe the judge and maybe the attorneys, well, they would have mind reading technology. Would you really want this? Probably not, but we're moving in that direction. This is that exponential growth that we're talking about and the impact of all of these things starting to come together. One of the last examples I like to give is a baby born today will live to 85 years old, 95 years old, 100 years old, 125 years. with all of the things that are happening, with the gene splicing materials that we can now put into DNA to allow for the removal of, let's say, DNA that's not the best, causing ailments or causing issues for people later in life or even earlier in life. You're actually able to splice that stuff out, put in new, and you're now getting to the point of 125 years is very likely with all of the changes that we're about to see. Fundamentally, this switch is about the democratization of technology. That is, taking technology like the cell phone, which came out, let's say, 25 years ago, with big old brick, and I ended up buying one of these things not long ago, a big brick, the Zach Morris telephone, what I grew up with, Zach Morris telephone. And it was this idea that the cell phone worked. It took 10 hours to charge. It had 60 minutes of talk time. It cost $4,500. Now you can go onto eBay. You can buy the old school cell phones for 45 cents. So technology that was very expensive, very difficult to get a hold of, is now becoming ubiquitous, easy to get access to. And all of these things are going to translate into things that we're all be able to get access to things around the world much more easily, globally. And it's going to change the way that we interact with each other and how law impacts a lot of these things at the same time. So what is happening? Well, I call it the trinity of forces, the triad of forces, three distinct forces at play that allow us to be able to implement, to use these technologies so that we can actually change the face, hopefully for positive. The first, of course, is cloud storage. So in 1955, IBM had a massive computer, probably the size of a typical bedroom, needed tons of cooling, and it had all of 5 megabytes of RAM. Now you can buy a chip the size of my fingernail off of Amazon that has exponentially more memory available to you in that sense. We're at a point where cloud storage and storage in general is ubiquitous and almost free in some senses. Very cheap, very easy to get access to. That's the first of the trinity of forces. The second is processing power. So how quick things like the processors in your phone, the processors in your computer can figure things out, right? Can open up an application, can solve mathematical problems. The way that I like to describe it quite simply is this. On the x-axis, it's time. On the y-axis, it is the calculations per second for a $1,000 computer. What does that mean? It means this. It means that if you were to buy a $1,000 computer back in 2001, it had the processing power of a gnat. A gnat's brain. Fantastic, right? You're like, all right. So the next iteration is 2009. The brand new computer that you bought would process as fast as a rat's brain. All right, let's fast forward. So 2024, it looks like a brand new computer that you'll buy, no matter what that looks like, maybe it's going to be more of a phone-based computer, which is really what they are anyways, will process as fast as the human's brain. This is the big leap forward when we're talking about that exponential growth. Is in 2044, you're looking at a brand new computer, and who knows what that will look like. It's probably going to be in your contact, will process as fast as all of humanity. So roughly 8 to 9 billion people. Fantastic. So unlimited memory, unlimited processing power, and now AI. All three of these come together to converge, to allow us to be able to do things that we've never been able to do before. To make it so that law firms, government agencies, corporations in the legal industry now can tap into things that they've never been able to tap into before. These things come together and allow us to get to the point of talking about things like blockchain. We wouldn't even be talking about blockchain unless all this stuff started to come together. Hence, this is where we are, and now let's get into blockchain. So let's talk about the history of it first, and then we'll slowly go through different components of this. I'm going to do it at more of a rudimentary level, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. There are other talks on this that go into more of the advanced components of it, but let's really bake it out, and let's hopefully make some sense out of this, because it can become very complicated very quickly. My goal is to try to simplify this as much as possible. So, of all things, let's talk about the history. Where in the world did blockchain come from? Well, of all things, it comes from Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has at its root the underlying components is blockchain. All right, why? So if you think back to 2008, 2009, when this stuff really started coming out, when it came out, there was a small financial crisis and it had ripple effects across the entire globe. Massive banks going under, large organizations going under because they were central points of authority. So a bank controlling all sorts of money and all sorts of inflow and outflow of monies and different applications in that space. And when things didn't work for them and they maybe invested in the wrong places, they blew up overnight. And it was a big mess for all sorts of industries, unfortunately. So this is where it gets a little bizarre. And what happened was, could have been a man, could have been a woman, a group of people. We do not know to this day. They saw this crazy disruption to the industry and the impact that it had. And they said, well, these huge banks are going under, and they were single points of failure. It meant that if they made a wrong decision about something, it had a massive impact on people in Africa, people in Asia, people in Europe, and businesses and governments. And we saw that. It was a very big downturn in the economy, of course. And they said, what can we do to change this paradigm? The name Satoshi Nakamoto, who is he or she, the inventor of this white paper that you see on the left-hand side, was this concept of decentralizing everything. And in this instance, it was decentralizing Bitcoin, so money. So the first instance of blockchain is Bitcoin, as we said before, was this concept of what can we do to decentralize money? And so they wrote this 10-page white paper. And the white paper basically goes through and says, all right, yes, you see these central points of failure. Well, let's change this paradigm. And let's have, instead of these big banks or whatever making the decisions on things, let's have computers make those decisions. And some people might cringe right away, like, oh, geez, here we go. So yes, you have 10,000 and now far more, 10,000 computers around the world, decentralized, running the exact same software that verify something happened, that verified that I am sending money to Alicia. And so what does that look like? Well, in the Bitcoin example, and we'll go in a different direction around this in a second. In the Bitcoin example, I have, let's pretend, 1 Bitcoin, and I want to send it to Alicia. Well, I have a digital wallet, and it's on my computer, or it's on my phone, and it's almost like sending an email. She tells me what her digital address is, her account number, so to speak. I then send 1 Bitcoin, click send, and it goes out to a batch of computers or nodes, so a grouping of computers that 1, verify that I actually have 1 Bitcoin in that wallet. 2, it checks to see if she has a wallet. Okay, once we know that I can actually send that money to her, it's in there, it goes to her wallet, it's then been sort of certified on that particular blockchain. Now, let's pause for a second. Anytime you hear the word blockchain, think database. It's a database that's decentralized. So it's not a central location, but there's many, many databases that are all connected to each other that have to verify something, that I sent money to her. And then it is registered onto the blockchain. So then the blockchain, think about as a ledger. So it's the database, it's a ledger, and it's being added to each one of these cells. So every single transaction that's ever happened goes into this database. It's immutable. So once you put it up there, you cannot change it. It's verifiable. So I can go back and look at her particular digital wallet address, and I can see every single transaction that she's ever made. Positives and negatives there, like all this technology. So fundamentally, in this instance, we're talking about a peer-to-peer electronic transfer. It means that I do not have to go through any banks. I do not have to go through any government agencies. It relies on cryptography. So it means that it is secure as it possibly can be when it comes to this sort of thing. So it's the same cryptography that the banks use today. It's been around since the 80s. So it's something that we can see is trusted thus far. I mean, we're about 11 or 12 years into this, and there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of people trying to hack this every single day. And so far, no one's been able to do that. They can hack the individual wallets that people have as an individual person that holds on to that, But other than that, it's been very, very solid. So fundamentally, what we're talking about is a complete change to the way that things are verified. We're using blockchain as a means of securing information by independent third party. That independent third party is a bunch of servers or computers that are verifying that something happened. It changes everything. We're not relying on all these intermediaries, humans, companies to say yes or no to something. We're saying that we trust in these computers to verify that something happened. Again, a significant shift in the way that we think about things. And this will clearly have an impact on the way that the legal industry verifies things going forward on many different ways. So that is the essence of blockchain. So I'll revisit this one last time. Blockchain, decentralized database that is secure. And that is the most important aspect about Bitcoin. Although Bitcoin started this thing, it's a little side thing. It's still important, but it's a side story to all of this. It's an important one, but just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. Now, I went through this already. So how does it work? Well, I have a digital wallet. Alicia has a digital wallet. I send money to her. The transaction represents a piece of this block that's in it. It verifies that on all these different computers. It gets a grouping that says, yes, we believe this happens. It adds that to the ledger of that blockchain in that database. Then going forward, it is a part of that, and the money is transferred. In the Bitcoin example, it means that it may take 20 minutes for me to send money to somebody in Iran or North Korea or anywhere else, right? Positives, negatives. I clearly chose those two countries on purpose. Brief tangent, there are people that are very concerned about the anti-money laundering components of this stuff. Looking at it, and there's groups, lots of groups that are looking at this, it represents less than 1% of all transactions at this point in time, and it's getting less and less going forward. So there's a positive story there. We'll talk about that more later. So encryption. Now, I feel compelled to go through encryption really quickly, and hopefully there's a little bit of fun here, but encryption is an important component of everything that we do these days. Your hard drive's hopefully encrypted. Your bank transactions, when you're online, you're always looking for those encryption little lock thing in the top left-hand corner. When you are engaging in any purchases, let's go through encryption, because when you're talking about blockchain, this is an important aspect of what we're talking about here. So the two key terms in encryption is public and private key. So public key and private key. Let's walk through it. So it all starts with Caesar. That's kind of the first recognized type of encryption that ever existed, and they call it the Caesar Cipher. So what does it mean? All right, well, Caesar wanted to communicate with his general back when, and his general will be, 3 or 4 months away in some far off region in Europe or whatever the case was, maybe North Africa. And what did he try to do when he tried to get the information from him to someone on a horse, carrying that bit of information to eventually the general? Well, before the general left for battle, he whispered something in his ear, and he said, "Hey, I want you to remember this. This is," and he didn't say this, but this is your private key. Private key represents an alphanumeric shift. Basically says, I want you to shift forward by one letter anything that I send you. So I'm going to send you a note, and that note's going to be all garblegook. But if you shift one letter forward, you will know what that message is. You are the only person to know this. You have the private key. I have the private key. We're good to go. So the key is at the bottom, as you can see. So the idea is shift forward by one letter. Now, a year down the road, Caesar's like, let's change the way we're doing this. We need to come up with a new plan here. And so what he does is he writes in his parchment paper a whole bunch of letters, and those letters that anybody could see are the public key. And he seals it up. He puts his actual wax seal on it, sends it off on horse and buggy or whatever it is across, and he sends multiple out just in case someone gets knocked over the head and someone steals this thing. Anybody can open it up. They know it's from Caesar. They can look at it, but they're not going to make heads or tail of it because it is completely and totally encrypted. This is the public key. It means you can show it to someone, means you can verify that you have some information about it, but they're not going to make sense of it. So anyone can see it, anyone can read it, but they don't understand it because it looks like those beautifully orange letters on your screen, NJTTZPR. Like, all right, I don't know what that means, but now you all have the private key. You know that if you were to shift this forward by one letter, that you're going to be able to break this down. So let's look at this right now. I'm going to pull it up. So N, we can shift forward by one letter is M. So only the general can do this and us. And you can shift it forward M. If you go to J, let's go on to the J, it goes to I. And if you go to TT, we know it's a double instance of it. So S, you get the idea. So he eventually writes, miss you. Yeah, well, good friends. And very nice of him to say that to his general. And so you get the idea at its core. That is what encryption is. It gets far more complicated. But the essence of encryption is that key idea is public and private key. So when we're talking about blockchain, very important concept is public and private key, because not too distant future, all of us are going to have to deal with this sort of thing going forward. So here we go. We're talking about the current state of blockchain and legal. When I started talking about this with law firms of all sizes and corporations and government agencies, it was 2016. And it was this idea of, okay, what's really happening here? Joe played around with this stuff in 2011. Most people were like, yeah, this, we may not get anywhere with this sort of thing, but this was the turning point. So 2016, there was $3.5 billion invested in it. All of the big banks completely changed their mind. So 50 of the biggest banks around the world got together and they started something called R3. And now law firms have joined it. And there was the idea of what can blockchain do potentially to disrupt the entire banking industry. And it was a big deal at the time, and now it's probably even bigger. So they made headway in this space and they backed out and they said, all right, let's do our own thing now. So each one of the banks is doing their own thing. 2017 for most law firms was a year of pilots. A lot of firms setting up blockchain practice areas, starting to take Bitcoin. Why would they take Bitcoin? As again, a small component of the bigger blockchain idea. It was to train and teach associates and partners and internal people what it's like to have a digital wallet. A digital wallet is very different than what you would have with your Bank of America or your Capital One account. It's a different mentality. You have to take ownership of that private key and the public key. So these elongated numbers and letters that you either share with people or you don't in the private key example. So understanding how to deal with that, understanding how to save those things in a private, secure place. These are the concepts I would invite you all to take advantage of, but we'll talk about that in a second. So also the year, the pilot in terms of this ICO. So we'll talk more about that as well. 2018, as we started to progress through time, real use of the technology. So law firms are consulting in this space, attorneys starting to learn how to code, reaching out and saying, hey, what do I need to do? Ethereum, which is the second biggest blockchain out there, and there are probably thousands of blockchains now. So thousands of these decentralized databases. Law firms are creating blockchain-enabled loyalty programs. So imagine having a law firm set up, you use our cryptocurrency, so to speak, at our firm, and we'll give you 15% off of all of our services. There were some firms that were doing that. Tokenizing wallet systems to teach their employees how to do things. There were consortia that popped up left and right, and worth taking a look at when you have time. The Global Legal Blockchain Consortium is one of them. Consensus is an open law group, and the Accord project for smart contracts, which we'll get into in not too distant future here. 2019 was firstly widely available applications for the industry. 2020, biggest applications are starting to integrate with it. And then now we're starting to see more general blockchain enabled functionality within the industry, which we will also talk about more. Now, this is one page that I think bears testament to the idea of what's changing and how quickly it changed. R3, the middle one, that's where all the banks, got in and said, all right, what can we do in this space? Ethereum, I mentioned. So Bitcoin, right, the first one. Ethereum was the second biggest of the blockchains. But what's so different about Ethereum is that you can create a programmable language on that blockchain to do things that we call smart contracts. A little bit of code on that database that execute on things, if-then statements. So if something happens, then do that. So think about if Amazon stock is $5,000 on January 1st, 2022, then sell or do whatever. We'll get into that because it plays perfectly into the legal industry, and we're already seeing many different groups build out these contracts. So anybody in that realm, in the transactional world, more than likely will have to get into this space in the not too distant future. Microsoft is headlong into this space. IBM is into it. Amazon are all building out infrastructure on blockchain to be able to leverage these pieces together at this point in time. So let's talk about the legal use cases right now in this space. So what I'm calling the blockchain of things, the opportunity and risks ahead. We're going to do a deep dive on smart contracts and self-executing legal documents in just a second. Real estate, we're also going to touch on this too, because if you're in this space, I'm surprised it hasn't taken off even more at this point. But I dare say in the not too distant future, it will. Boardroom, we're not going to touch any more on this, but recording which C-suite voted for which various proposals. With blockchain, if you're able to see how a chain of activity happens by looking at that clearly, it's an accountability thing. It's perfect for those in the accounting world to also look at. Identity, we'll also talk about in a little bit. Chain of title, so tracking ownership of property back to the creation, knowing where it came from. That's a wonderful part of all of this. Authentication, so verifying things like diamonds or signed memorabilia or any of those pieces is also a big component to this. Notary services. What are we talking about here? Of course, we're talking about verifying that someone signed something in front of someone. Well, at its basis, that's what blockchain can do, because you can create a legal identity about yourself and you're verifying that you were signing something. Makes it much easier to do so. Rental contracts. This is another area that we'll talk about in just a second. But of all groups, Airbnb, who's threatening, of course, the biggest hotel chains in the world, is also now vulnerable to newer technologies like blockchain, because you can build out new companies in what we call DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. These are going to be an area that I think legal is going to absolutely thrive on if you decide to go down this road, but that's fun. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then music licensing, that's kind of a random one, but also something that we'll see more and more of. Money transfer is yet another area that we are seeing clearly, because you can do that with Bitcoin now in terms of money being sent from one person to another around the world very easily. So let's talk about the smart contract. And I think if there were probably a handful of slides, this would be towards the top of the most important slides that I would focus in on. So all of you attorneys practicing, most of you probably are not in trusts and estates, but you probably have family or relatives or friends or whatever the case is who say, oh yeah, you're an attorney, can you draw up my will for me? Yeah, it's not really my thing. I specialize in IP, but sure, I'll do it for you. And so what are you supposed to do, right? You pull up maybe a Word document, you get some templates, you pull that in, paragraph by paragraph, you build it out. Here is my goofy will. My will says this. It says, upon the parents' death, they have two kids, kid A and kid B. Both kids have to be married in order for them to split the estate. If one kid is married and one is not, the kid that's married gets 100% of the estate. You type it up. You're like, all right, we're good to go. You put it into a PDF document, you get it notarized, whatever the case is, you're good to go. Now, this is where things change. So now it's put into a program, and the program basically extrapolates, it learns, it looks at the functionality of that document, and it says, okay, what are the executables here? What do I need to focus in on? So the computer looks at this and it says, the first thing that I need to look at every single day is to make sure that both parents are alive or not. So through an API call, so a computer to a computer call, through it to a trusted source called an oracle, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's a trusted source. Maybe it's Thomson Reuters, maybe it's the federal government, the Social Security Administration, whatever the case is, reaches out every single day. Are both parents alive? For years, it says, yes, they're alive. One day comes back and both have passed. The computer then says, okay, what's my next task? Well, my next task is to determine whether or not both kids are married. Does the same sort of API call to another trusted source, and it comes back and says, one kid is married, one is not. My next task is to execute on this will and pay out 100% of the estate, because it's all liquid, to the individual that is married. And boom, the money goes out to the person that is married. This entire right-hand side that you see on your screen is all automated. This information is in the blockchain, so it's using smart contract, which is a little bit of code executing on variables, using the oracle, so reaching out to other sources to determine that information is accurate, pulling it back and making a decision that is automated. I know each and every one of you could probably poke holes in this. What if the data is wrong? You know, we don't have, these people were married in Fiji. Do we have that information? Yes, there are things that we need to think about, but there are businesses, cartloads of businesses that are building out and solving for the problems that you might be able to see in this space. So growth beyond growth is coming in this space, but an important concept nonetheless, smart contracts and coding. Okay, so real estate, let's talk about this. This is an island that you own. Beautiful island, right? All the other islands in the area know that you own and live on this property. You have your beautiful house there, a dock, it's blue water and no sharks and all sorts of wonderful stuff. So everyone in the area knows that you own it, but you don't have a deed to it. It's just known, which is, believe it or not, 80% of the world is undeeded property, which is crazy to think about, but is true. And so here's the concept. Now, someone reaches out to the federal government in that particular region of the world and says, hey, we'll give you $10 million for that plot of land. And they're like, sure, we don't have, they're not deeded. Yeah, absolutely, take it. The problem there is that that could happen overnight, and that could happen in certain parts of the world. So there are companies that are building out models that are using blockchain to verify that somebody owns a piece of property where it is in the clear. You can go to this blockchain. It's redundant because there's multiple blockchains that are verifying this, such that it's not just your neighbors that are saying you own this. You actually have something you can point to in that instance. In the future, you're going to see that all of our real estate deeds are put into the blockchain. In the United States, not as big a deal, clearly, because we have an established way of doing that with court records and all that sort of thing. But going forward, you're going to see a move in this direction, and then a lot of intermediaries are going to be impacted in that space. Something to be aware of. Okay. Going forward, real estate again. So there's also other groups that are trying to build out end-to-end solutions. And if you've ever had to buy a piece of property, a condo, whatever, a house or building, whatever it is, it's a system that hasn't changed much over the last, who even knows, 50, 60, 80 years. This industry is ripe to change. There's a lot that's going on in this space to make it so that it's far easier for you to engage, make decisions, and then, of course, execute on that as quickly as possible. A lot of people are, of course, settling in 30 days. It's moving to 7 days. What if it happened within a day or two? That's the direction that we will see, clearly leveraging blockchain to be able to determine things and then add that to that blockchain, making sure that you have the deed and then it's all set to go. So title insurance is also going to be moving in that space. All of this is likely to happen. So other real world use cases include virtually everything you can think about on the corporation side. So supply chain management, healthcare, real estate, media, energy, governments, record management, everything within the scope of tracking information and proving that is going to fall into this space. And then you could build out workflows that surround that. So I cannot go any further about blockchain unless we're talking about cryptocurrencies. Now, 2017 was the big year of cryptocurrencies, I know, and then it all kind of died off, and now we're actually at a point where they're above where they were roughly back then in the bigger scheme of things. And people were like, it's kind of this fad. And maybe it still is, but I don't believe it is really anymore for the vast majority. If you haven't ever done this, I'm not advising, but I'm encouraging you to go out to an exchange. Coinbase, again, I'm not pushing anybody in any different direction. Coinbase is established, based in San Francisco, United States, and it's the most well-known and most trusted of all the exchanges, of which there are roughly 150 around the world. How does this work? You basically open up an account with Coinbase, you verify yourself beyond belief. I mean, you're at a point where you have to verify, you take a selfie with your ID or your passport in front of your camera that you have on your computer. It verifies you, looks at your address, looks at your social security number, everything. Almost more verification that you would need for opening up a regular bank account. But once you do that, you could transfer your normal fiat currency. Let's say you're in the United States, you're transferring over US dollars. And at that point in time, you can then go in almost like a Fidelity account or almost like a Schwab account or any other one of these accounts that you have in there. You can buy cryptocurrency. So you can buy Bitcoin, you can buy Ethereum, you can buy Litecoin, or any, let's say in this account, probably another 100 other cryptocurrencies that are out there. Now, what would you do with that? Well, a lot of people are buying it and holding on to it with the expectation that it will eventually go up in value. That was the original intent. But there are different use cases that we'll get into in just a second for why you would even buy some of these other ones that are out there. So at that point in time, you have cryptocurrency that's in your digital wallet. This is on an exchange, so you don't own the private key. You have the public key, which means you can send it to other people. But in order for you to truly have ownership of that, you would need your own private wallet on your phone, which you can download apps to do, and then you could transfer that to a digital wallet on your phone, at which point you own the private and public key. Small distinction, but I wanted to bring that up, tied into what we were talking about. So there are roughly 8,500 different cryptocurrencies at the time of this filming. 8,500. This was about a year or 2 years ago. At this point in time, there were 1,500. Bitcoin is the big dog of all of these right now. Ethereum, like I said, is the second. But they're different use cases. So Bitcoin is basically trying to supplant or be a component very similar to the dollar, the euro, the yen, whatever the case is. It's trying to be money. Ethereum, like I said before, is a programmable language that allows you to interact with the blockchain. And you need a little bit of Ethereum called ETH to save things. So think back to the contract for that will. If I want to save that to the blockchain and have it self-execute on things, well, I need a little bit of that ETH, that Ethereum. So I spend up maybe, well, now it costs a lot, but let's say I spend 10 cents to save it to that blockchain. I need the ETH to do that. So I'm saving it to that blockchain. It's encrypted, it's safe, it's secure. And anytime I want to reference that, I can do so. If I want to change it, then I might have to pay a little bit of ETH to change that document. So that's another use case. There are countless different types of use cases, and each one of these that you see on your screen is essentially another use case in this space. All right, this is a little old school, but I want to tie the relevance to all of this together. So the ICO, the initial coin offering, is really why we even started talking about this, but it was an initial way to raise money. And this is kind of bonkers. Way back when in 2017, this is how people did it. And any one of you can actually still do this. I don't advise that you do it. I did it way back when. I did not sell the tokens. I still have them in just a wallet that I hold on to. No intention of selling it, just for the clarity there. The idea is this: you have an idea, a business idea, just like any other business idea that you may have right now, and you want to raise money for that. Well, what do? You come up with the idea, you build your website, just like any other website you want to build. But this is where it changes. So you write a white paper about exactly your intent and your purpose and the timeline for when you want to launch. So what you do is you open up the white paper and you say, this is what we're going to do from January 1st to January 15th. You can come to our website with your digital wallet. And for the 1 Bitcoin that you give us, we will give you a set of tokens, 10,000 Joe coins. And I'll send that to you. Once you transfer to us 1 Bitcoin, I'll give you 10,000 Joe coins. You're like, what in the world? Why would I want 10,000 Joe coins? All of that transaction happens with that intermediary, that third party, right? The blockchain. So it's a computer. You're sending that off to the blockchain. It's verifying it. It's then sending you the 10,000. So you're donating those funds to the project via that website. The transactions are stored on the blockchain. It's a record in that smart contract. I'm then giving you those 10,000 coins that you then put into your digital wallet. And then this is what is the crazy part back then. It doesn't happen as much, but is still available, is now you have those 10,000 coins. And some people would say they're like shares. They're not. They're not sort of SEC sanctioned. They don't sort of abide by those rules and regulations in general. I mean, you have to now in the guidance that they offer, which we'll talk about in a second. But you now have these 10,000 tokens. And this is where the zaniness came about. So now I have these 10,000 tokens. They're in my wallet. I'm like good to go. You wait another few months. Then you take those tokens and you port them over to one of the 150 different exchanges out there, right? And that's where people were then bidding up the value of those tokens. Let's say the token value at the time that I got that at the ICO price were 10 cents a piece. They would go to 20 cents, to 40 cents, to $1, sometimes $10, sometimes $100 for every token. So people were making millions of dollars in this space back then in this world. So that's why we're really talking about some of this right now, because it became very popular. Now, this has since transitioned to a new way of looking at it. So now there's STOs, and it's become very global because in the United States, there's not as much guidance. There's not as much guidance. The rules and regulations are a little bit, they're still there, but they're not. We'll talk about it in a second. So you're seeing other variations of this. So one is security token offering, and this is what we're trying to do is bring companies and businesses in line with what the SEC would want all of us to do when issuing these types of tokens. And an important part of this is the SEC versus the Howey test. So this comes back about in 1946. So we're leaning on some pretty old rules, regulations, and laws here, right, with this case. So the requirements are thus that when you look at the raising of money, how is this treated? So requirements are fourfold. First is, does it involve an investment of money? It has to hit all four to be considered a security. The second is there an expectation of profit from the investment? Third, investment of money, and is it a common enterprise? And then lastly, are the profits derived from the promoter or a third party? Are they involved in this at the same time? So these are an important concept to look at when we're talking about raising money using this new means of doing so in that space. Now, sometimes I go off on this demo and I show you exactly how people do this sort of thing and take people through, okay, if I wanted to issue this code, then you could actually create the code, issue your tokens. It's kind of a neat process, but for the sake of time, we won't do it today. But there are many ways of doing this. Ultimately, there are exchanges you can take it to. The exchanges, like I said before, are fascinating to watch and look at. There's many of them out there. And I put this up for good reason, because there are some here like Coinbase we've talked about established. Kraken is another that's established. Poloniex, whatever, is one that's been around for quite some time. And then you have BTC-E, which was an exchange that was known for lots of money laundering way back when, supposed money laundering in Russia. So full range of things going on here just to be aware of. Now, let's go forward very briefly. One concept, and you can hear more about this in more of an advanced talk, is DeFi. DeFi stands for decentralized finance. What I want you to do for a second is imagine a time where every single type of financial instrument that we know today, from banking to investment, to exchanges, to derivatives, and all the components around it. KYC, so knowing your customer, the AML components of it, the prediction, all of that at some point in time will be ported over leveraging blockchain. All of the litigation that comes from that will be all around blockchain in and of itself too. So want you to be aware of it, thinking about this space. And Ethereum is one of the biggest blockchains out there to be aware of in this space. There's a lot of other ones out there, but important to be just generally thinking about it, I guess. Okay, so because this has become a thing that I did not expect would become a thing, I feel compelled to put this one up too. So NFTs. NFT stands for non-fungible token. It is the worst acronym in the world, and I'm going to define it in just a second. But this is the incarnation of what this really means. You see this beautiful picture up on your screen. You know, I'm being facetious, of course. This is a pixelated looking old school thing from 1994-ish, and I used to do design work as a little kid back then. This sold recently. It's called a crypto punk. It's one of the first pieces of art put onto the blockchain that's represented as a unique piece of art. So this has a number, and it has a place you can go to verify this. Makes it scarce, makes it valuable for some because it's one of the first ever to be made. Was sold recently for $100,000 in ETH, so in Ethereum, but the value of it is $100,000. Here's another one, and to expand the mindset on this, Jack Dorsey, obviously the original, the CEO behind Twitter, has his first tweet. His first tweet, he just recently sold because he put it onto the blockchain, making so that you could buy this, sold for actually over $2.5 million. A last one, Beeple, who's an artist, has been around for quite some time, has done artwork for Apple and Nike and things of that nature, sold a collection of his art for almost $70 million. A unique key given to that particular piece of art, just like what you saw on the left-hand side with Jack Dorsey's thing. You might be saying, why would I ever do this? Well, in the art piece, it's unique. You can download this, you can look at it, blah, blah, blah. You can hopefully hope that it's going to be worth something more at some point in time. In the Jack Dorsey tweet, you can get royalties on that. So a non-fungible token, quite simply, is a unique identifier stored on the blockchain representing a distinct piece of information. This can be extrapolated out to anything in the tokenization of all assets. So that means a deed to a property is a unique piece of property, right? Just like a piece of paper, but that's also part of this. All right, we need to go forward. Privacy coins, a lot of people think Bitcoin is completely private and anonymous. It is not. It's pseudo-anonymous. Once I know Alicia's address that she gave me so I could send her some money, I know every single transaction. There are other cryptocurrencies out there, and this is for the AML people, Monero, Zcash, which are completely and totally anonymous, and for good reason. I'm in Iran, and I want to learn a little bit more about democracy. I want a pamphlet on that, so I go onto the dark web, and I'm able to find this pamphlet, and the good people on the dark web decided to sell that to me. So if I want to continue to be anonymous, I use one of these currencies to be able to then get this pamphlet so I can learn more about it and spread the word. So there are good use cases for these things. Again, there's also the negative. So what does the future look like of blockchain? Digital identity is one of these pieces. So that basically means that we're all going to have a new identity different than our social security number in the not too distant future, where probably not the Social Security Administration, maybe the Department of Homeland Security will issue this new code on the blockchain. You will get your private key, store it safe. You get your public key to verify that you are who you are, of an age, that you have property, whatever the case is. So we're moving to a point of where there's tokenization of all assets. So think about a large building, and this happened recently in the UK, where they sold a £100 million building and allowed for the every person, the every man, the every woman to buy a stake in that. And they were able to buy £100 worth of that building. And then they were able to take ownership of that partial digital token into their wallet, proving that they own part of that fancy building. So real estate, commodities, everything in that space, and the deed to your car. It's a little token in your wallet. All right, you want to sell it. Someone put the money up in the blockchain, verifying it's almost in custody, right? It's up there. It's once you see that it's up there, then you can send them almost via an email the token. Now they have ownership of it, and the money transfers to you. So the future kind of looks like this. We're moving from everything being centralized. So Facebook is centralized, Google is centralized, Amazon is centralized. And now there are new models to completely change that dynamic so that those things are even decentralized. I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but think about this for a second and the implications of it. So PPIF, up in the left-hand corner there, is a new version of Twitter. So in the Twitter example, basically everything routes, so anything you post, anything anybody else posts, goes to their servers. So no matter what it is, it's a picture, it's a video, it's a tweet, all that stuff goes onto their servers. They ultimately control what's there and what's not there. And for better or for worse, that's probably a good thing. But PPIF and many other organizations like this are basically making so that is decentralized, so that nobody controls the data that you upload into it, because the new tweet that you put into PPIF goes into this decentralized world. So I can put up any idea that I want to put up there, and no one can remove it or take it down. Maybe there's some problems with that, maybe not, depending on what side you're looking at it. In more recent worlds, not to get too political, maybe that's not necessarily a good thing, but that's the direction of the potential for this technology going forward. IPFS, which is kind of I love this thing because it came out quite some time ago, and it's just a bonkers one to think about. IPFS stands for Interplanetary File System. It's kind of bizarre name, and what it means is that any hard drive space you have on your computer, any hard drive space you have on your phone, you can lend out, which means that you have it open, and if you want people to be able to save information to that hard drive in an encrypted fashion, and only a partial amount of that, so it's a 1,000-page legal document, it's encrypted, only like pages 1 and 10 and 15 are on that. You can lease out that space. You are paid for that. It's basically the world's cloud. So everyone participates in this. And because there's 3 trillion computers or phones that are all involved in this space, you're now a part of that. And so that kind of disrupts Amazon. Just like PPIF can upset or have an effect on Twitter in that space. All of these things are about to change the way that we interact with data, especially from the legal side. Oracles, we mentioned, are a trusted source of information that you know should be accurate. So there's a lot of various groups that are working in this space to verify that contracts are actually being stored on the blockchain. You can verify that ID of that it's not been touched, has not been affected. You know that not a single letter in that contract has been changed once it's been put up into the blockchain. Another concept. So the shift forward, what we're really talking about is you having that unique identifier, you interacting with objects. And that object will also have an identifier. In this instance, we're talking about potentially a doorknob, right? So you're going to visit Airbnb, and then you're interacting with that doorknob. The doorknob has smart contract language. The contract for how long you're supposed to be there, when you're supposed to leave, when you need to have the place cleaned. All of this stuff is on the blockchain using these digital smart contracts that have the legalese baked into it, proving something out that if this happens, then that should happen. Clearly, things will go off the road there for a second, and so of course litigation will play a role in all of this. So that's the shifting forward. So what are we really seeing? Well, we're seeing that there's a lot of potential here. There's potential for fraud. There's potential for a lot of good things to come. This is the direction that we're going to see things move in, no question in this space. Federal law with the IRS, the CFTC, as well as the Treasury Department and Congress, each component in this space is looking at this in their own lens. And they're all coming out with things that are constantly new in some respects. IRS seeing it as property. And so every single transaction you ever do should be seen as property, whether capital gains or not. Congress is hopefully coming out with more guidance on this in the not too distant future as well. SEC, same sort of thing. Lots of things happening in this space, and being mindful of time, you can certainly pause at this and take a look at it. The challenges ahead are skeptics, ideology, essentially all this starts with anti-establishment roots, but there's lots of potential but there's also regulatory issues that need to come about in this space as well. So very quickly, things have changed dramatically. If we look at the internet as the very beginning of things, then email was the first true application, then web and smartphones, apps, and then eventually Uber, we're at the very beginning. So the blockchain is the very beginning days. So we're going to see a lot of change in this space. Going forward, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Happy to talk about these things. There's a lot of different crossover between this and AI and all the other pieces within the legal industry. Very happy you were able to join us today. Alicia and I are happy here to answer any questions that you may have. Feel free to reach out. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.